Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, and blessings to the Prophet, peace be upon him, his family, and his companions. I hope you're all well in these unusual times and out enjoying the sun today. It's so nice to stay in contact with each other, and that's why we've tried to organise all of these events. We would love to welcome you to today's Pearl of Wisdom by Medina Whiteman on Andalusia. Medina Whiteman is an author, singer, and poet and has published multiple books. She also has a BA from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and she now lives in Andalusia with her husband and 3 children. I think the history of Muslim Spain is fascinating, from the Umayyads to the Convivencia. And today's talk will cover the knowledge revolution of Andalusia, economic advancements of Muslim Spain, as well as the Convivencia and pluralism. We may also have time for a few questions at the end, so if you have anything to ask, please put it in the chat and we'll try to answer it at the end. So without further ado, could I please pass it over to you, Auntie?
Thanks so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum, Sumaya, and everyone who's joining us from wherever you may be. As Sumaya said, my name is Medina Tenour Whiteman. I'm an author. These are 2 of my books that I'm going to be drawing on a little bit today. This is a travel guide to Islamic Spain. And this is my most recent book, The Invisible Muslim. So just to give a little bit preface to what I'm going to be talking about, why I got interested in this in the first place. So I was born in Granada, in the Albaicin, which is a neighborhood of Granada that was built by Muslims. Many of the cities that became famous under the Muslims were pre-existing. Seville, for example, Cordoba. Some were built by Muslims specifically, for example, Madrid. Granada was actually developed a little bit later on in the timeline. It was originally a Jewish settlement, Qarnata al-Yahudi, and then with the conquest of a town called Baeza, close to Jaén, the inhabitants, who were called al-Bayezin, fled and went to Granada, and they wanted to live somewhere, so they built a neighborhood on one of the hills, and that became known as the Albaicin, or the Al-Bayezin. So that's where I was born. And then I grew up in England. I'm the child of converts, American English converts. So especially at that time, and I'm sure people can relate to this now, but especially in the 80s and the 90s, converts were quite thin on the ground, and it was a little bit of a strange experience at times, kind of trying to work out the usual sort of teenage quest for identity, and that question of who am I, where do I belong. It was a little bit of a complicated, turbulent period for me. But when I went to Spain and I saw some of the Spanish Muslims there, who were also from the same kind of generation or second generation of converts, they didn't seem to have any of this identity crisis at all. And I realized it was because they had this history, which is basically 800 years, just under 800 years of history, spanning from 711 CE to 1492. That's the official period of Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula. So it wasn't just Spain, it was also the south of Portugal, which is where we get the word Algarve from, the Algarve. It's from Al-Gharb al-Andalus, it's the western part of Andalus. So I won't go into too much detail about all the things that happened, because it's a very, very long period of history and an awful lot happened in there. But there are a few really salient features that I want to talk about. But it didn't end, importantly, it didn't end in 1492. 1492 is the time that the political entity of Al-Andalus ended, which is when the last Nasrid king, the last Muslim king of Spain, Boabdil, gave over the keys of Granada to the Catholic kings, Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand. The Muslims were allowed to live for a short while longer. Officially, according to the capitulation treaty, they were allowed to continue living in Spain. As Muslims, Arabic would be permitted, and so on and so forth. But within a couple of decades, that was torn up. And in the early 16th century, right at the beginning, they banned Arabic, they banned Islam, and forcibly baptized Muslims. And the Jews were either baptized or exiled. They were given a choice, either convert or flee, go into exile. And of course, people had to pay their own passage, so the wealthy people were allowed to leave. They could board boats and go. There were cases, it's reported, there were cases of people not being able to take their children with them on the boats, and they would have to leave their children behind, which is really heartbreaking. But it's thought that about 40% of the Muslims of Spain remained. and another 10% came back again from exile because they loved being there. It was their home, it was their homeland. So what's really interesting is this period, not only the period of Al-Andalus, this 800 years, but also since then, another 500 years. That's 1,300 years of history. That's almost the entire history of Islam. And Muslims have been in Spain all that time. So that's what's really fascinating to me. And when I moved back to Spain, after I finished my degree, it was about 12, 13 years ago, I started meeting people who were converts and who really said, you know, my family have been Muslim all this time. And some really extraordinary examples. For example, I met a guy he's from Extremadura, which is a very mountainous region of Spain on the border of Portugal. And it's a place where historically Muslims were very defiantly, they were renegades. So even after the baptisms, there's evidence that they would go into the mountains, to the springs and the rivers and do unbaptisms. And so they were very defiant. They didn't want to be baptized at all. And in fact, in the end, a large number of them, I don't know exactly how many, several thousand, were marched to Seville, put on a boat and sent to Rabat in Morocco, where they founded the Corsair city. I think it was actually Republic of Salé, which is why Salé and Rabat are kind of twin cities. And the mayor of Hornachos, which is one of the main Muslim centers of Extremadura, was called Vargas. That was the surname, a very common surname there. And it still is, Vargas. It's become Vargas in Spanish. And the mayors of Salé continue to be from the Vargas family until quite recently. And they took their revenge on the Spanish by attacking and plundering Spanish galleons coming back from the New World, loaded with stolen Mayan gold. So I met a guy from Extremadura, from this area. And initially I thought he was Moroccan. He was married to a Moroccan woman, and he almost looked like he could have been Moroccan. I mean, the Mediterranean area, people often look very similar anyway. And then it transpired that he had converted, but he remembered his grandmother washing her hands and face every day and going down to the basement of their house and putting her head on the floor to pray. And she didn't describe herself as a Muslim, but you can see that there are certain influences, certain aspects of Islamic culture, even things like the siesta. I mean, nobody has sort of done any study on this, but to me it seems quite natural. This seems, it's like a sunnah, right? It's sunnah to have a sleep after lunch and a walk after dinner, and this is what people in the south of Spain do. So that was something that I found really, really fascinating. So I started reading up on it, and my mum also, she's read a lot more than me, but we co-wrote this book together, which is where a lot of this information came from, and it went into this book as well. So what was really special about Al-Andalus? There were a number of major advances, beginning with the knowledge revolution. We can really call it knowledge revolution because at that time, in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, knowledge was very jealously guarded. Partly that was because it was literally very, very difficult to have a book because everything had to be written out on parchment or vellum. And that's the skin of a calf that has been stretched and treated and dried. So you can imagine that's very expensive and not very practical to write on. So it was only for very, very valuable things like the Bible, for example. And very few of them even existed at all. It's thought that around the year 1000 in Cordoba, or perhaps a little bit before that, in Cordoba there were a number of public libraries, but there were 4 private libraries with 250,000 books each. So Cordoba at this time, this was in the Caliphate, because the Muslims had introduced paper making to Europe, this meant that they were able to write out copies of books relatively easily. I mean, still it was, you know, they were still being made by hand, but they had factories making them. And they had, I think, hundreds of copyist workshops and studios in Cordoba, which was the most popular city in Europe at that time. Several copyist workshops entirely staffed by women. So there were literally millions of books in the major cities. There were public libraries. I don't think they were as big as the private libraries, but again, we're talking about over 1,000 years ago. But they weren't just in the hands of the elite. They were accessible to everyone. In the Cordoban Caliphate, education was free and obligatory for all children of any faith. So there were Muslims and Christians and Jews living in Cordoba at the time, and including children of slaves. Education was obligatory. And on top of that, they had this inheritance of translations that had come from Beit al-Hikmah, from Baghdad. And Cordoba was really, it was seen almost on a par with the Beit al-Hikmah. There were princes and scholars and nuns and monks from all over Christian Europe that went to study there, and also in Toledo. Scholars were patronized by royals who all competed in having the cleverest minds at their courts. And the scholars were polymaths, so they were versed in rhetoric, grammar, and logic, that was the trivium, as well as languages, poetry, music, astronomy, botany, medicine, metallurgy, I mean, all kinds of different fields, as well as the Islamic sciences. They weren't afraid of learning from ancient Greece. And this was what really demarcated them from the rest of Christian Western Europe at the time, who they were very, very frightened of anything that was tainted with heresy. So any kind of knowledge, whether it was Aristotle or Galen or Ptolemy or anything like that, was off the menu. You couldn't learn it. But Muslims were not afraid of that. They would translate things from Jewish sources, from ancient Egyptian sources, wherever they could get knowledge from. They saw it as, you know, like the hadith, that wisdom is the, what is it? Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. He can claim it wherever he finds it. So they really took this to heart. They also founded in Toledo a school of translators, and you can look this up. I hope people have got notepads and pens and pencils, because there's lots of things I'm going to be dropping here I won't be able to talk in a great depth about, but go to Wikipedia and you'll get a brief overview of all these different things. So the School of Translators in Toledo, which was, it was begun by under Muslim rule, but also after the Muslim rule fell in Toledo, which was fairly early on, I think it was in the 11th century. First there was Raymond in the 12th century, and then Alfonso X in the 13th century. They protected and nurtured this school of translators. And so they had Christians, Jews, and Muslims all translating things from Arabic, things that entered Latin via Arabic. So things like the work of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Dioscorides, who was a very famous botanist. He wrote not the first, but he wrote Materia Medica, which was still in use, you know, for hundreds of years. Pliny. And the Muslims of Al-Andalus also came up with certain innovations. So Ibn Khaldun, who was of Sevillian and Tunisian heritage, he wrote Al-Muqaddimah, which is called the Introduction to World History. And it's thought to be the first work of historiography. So he was the first person to try to take an overview of world history and look at the sort of phases of boom and bust and empire and things like this, which was actually incredibly apt. He said that every 4 generations that the current, whoever's currently in power will become decadent and collapse. And another wave of rulers will come in who are kind of tough and fresh, because they haven't become sort of weakened by palatial pleasures. And that's exactly what happened. The Almoravids and the Almohads, other way around, Almohads and Almoravids, they each had about 100 years of rule. It's very interesting. Ibn al-Baytar, he was the first botanist, he's from Malaga, first botanist to empirically study plants, the first person to actually do that and document them and name them. And naming plants is a tradition that Muslims have had all through Muslim history, all over the Muslim world. And that actually comes from the Quran, to name plants and naming plants and species. Ibn-Tufayl, he was a philosopher. He arguably wrote the first novel, especially the first philosophical novel, but it's a very, he wrote it nearly 1,000 years ago. It's philosophical treatise. It's called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, Alive, Son of Awake. It imagines a man, a prince, being shipwrecked as a baby and washing onto an island and being raised by a deer. And along the way, he sort of has all these different stages of awareness in which he notices creation, and he notices the heavens, he starts to see a divine order and everything. This was translated into English and published just a few years before Robinson Crusoe came out. So some people see that this was the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. Their work also influenced the rest of the Muslim world. So Al-Andalus was seen as a kind of promised land for many people in the Middle East, even though there were many similarities there. Ibn Arabi, Ibn Abbas, and Mursi, they both traveled to Syria and Egypt respectively, and they influenced Sufism. And Abu Madian, he was the most influential Western Sufi of his time. He was from Seville. He ended up in Algeria. Agricultural canon works from Al-Andalus were used for centuries in the Arab world. For example, the work of Ibn Awam. I'm not expecting you to remember all of these names, but look them up afterwards. Ibn Awam is very interesting. So sustainability, that I've been led here on purpose. So the Andalusi system of governance brought stability. It wasn't unified all the time. Initially, there was a period of taifas, which were small states, city-states, and petty principalities. And then the Caliphate of Cordoba came in for around about 300 years, something like that. And then it collapsed, and there was a second taifa period. And then there was the Emirate of Granada. For the last 250 years of the existence of Al-Andalus, it was reduced to one area, which was ruled by the kings of Granada, based in Granada. And that encompassed Almeria to the east and Malaga to the west, and Jaén, and also Ronda, which was on its own, it was a very important city. Because the initial conquest was very, very rapid, but immediately started shrinking. The land overtaken immediately started shrinking. And as Muslims in northern parts of Al-Andalus were overtaken by Christian rule, often they would flee and go to the south. And so towards the end, Granada had something like 1 million inhabitants, which I believe was about equivalent to the entire rest of the Iberian Peninsula. And it had all of the, master architects, craftsmen, traders, master agriculturists. So that's something I want to talk about for a moment. What time is it? 20 past. So they had this burgeoning society. Overall, generally there was a lot of stability. There were spats between different city-states, especially during the Taifa period. I mean, all of medieval history, unfortunately, if you look at it, it's a pretty ugly scene. Cousins and nephews and brothers and sisters killing each other to try and get the throne and whatever. So I don't want to be too nostalgic and romanticize this period either. However, there were long periods of stability in which there was a flourishing and a civilization that really was burgeoning. So they had to feed all these people in order to do that. And the two went hand in hand. As people were fed, of course, they became more productive in other ways. So crafts, ceramics, things like this also advanced. There were advances in public hygiene and medicine. Again, going back to Cordoba around about the year 1000, they had hundreds of hammams made of black and white marble with hot and cold running water. There was municipal rubbish collection by donkeys. On top of that, there was an awareness of cleanliness, of course, because of Islam. And in fact, as the Christians conquered progressively different parts of Al-Andalus, they would criticize the Muslims for being clean and also for being industrious, because they had a sort of an hidalgo complex. And hidalgo means hijo de algo, like son of someone or something, like an important person, a nobleman. And so people wanted to be, like a knight in shining armor, riding a horse and owning land and having serfs, much like the rest of medieval Northern Europe. They weren't really interested in producing. And I'll come to that later. That's led to the modern world as we know it post 1492. But the Muslim approach to health was largely based on, and this is true for all of the Muslim world, on food. So healthy food was considered the best medicine, and preventative medicine, preventing illness, was the first port of call. And then after that, there would be drugs, medicines that would be almost entirely made from plants, from plant sources. So they were also geniuses of arid climate agriculture. And partly they had developed this out of knowledge that came from Yemen. So Yemen is a country that it rains maybe 1 month of an entire year, and yet the Queen of Sheba was known for being a very wealthy woman because her lands were very, very green and abundant. The hanging gardens of Yemen were famous in antiquity. That goes back something like 6,000 years, a really long time. So this kind of knowledge of how to grow food in extremely dry environments was adopted and incorporated into lots of different, there was knowledge from the Romans, from the Greeks, from the Persians, from anywhere, because knowledge is knowledge. If it's useful, it's useful. They would adopt it and they'd adapt it. So one of the main reasons why it was so successful is that centralized governments would actually sponsor irrigation networks. And in order to irrigate, you either have to take water from a high place, like snowmelt from mountains, which is what the Sierra Nevada provided. There were hundreds of miles of irrigation canals coming from the top of the high Mulafin, which is the highest mountain in the Sierra Nevada. In fact, it's the highest mountain in all of mainland Spain. It's named after Muley Hassan, who was a king of Granada. That go into the Alhambra, that go all the way through the Albaicin of Granada. There's still a road called Calle Agua in the Albaicin, and that's where, you know, all the hammams used to be in that area, for example. So that's a whole other topic I could talk a lot more about. I'll have to sort of skip along. So the acequias were initially, they were partly developed by the Romans, but the Muslims massively developed them. The Romans they didn't actually spend a huge amount of time in Spain. Spain has been a very pluralist mixed place ever since antiquity. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, Carthaginians, I mean, all kinds of people have been here. So the irrigation canals in the mountains they're called acequias, right? Which comes from the Arabic astaqiya, which means irrigation canal. There are also qanats. I've seen photos, I haven't been to one, but I've seen photos of a qanat, which is a water tunnel. It's actually dug into rock, going into a mountain to reach aquifers of springs. This is directly taken from Yemeni agriculture. And also norias. So in flat land where there aren't mountains, you have to raise water a number of meters in order to be able to let it move by gravity. And so they introduced the naura, which is then became noria in Spanish. And I think there's still one in Cordoba on the Wad al-Kibir, Many place names come from Arabic. Wad al-Kibir is Wad al-Kabir, right? The large river. So in Valencia, which is a fairly flat region, there were about 8,000 water wheels installed. They were just made of wood. I mean, somebody had to be a total genius carpenter to come up with this. And in Valencia, they have a lot of rice fields. That's where paella is popularized. Paella, just to make a little detour, tangent, paella comes from the Arabic word baqiya, but because the Arabic was spoken in Andalus came from the Levant, came from Syria, they didn't pronounce the qaf. They pronounced it as a glottal stop. So it was ba'iyya. Ba'iyya means leftovers. So on a Thursday night, they would take all the leftover food, but some cooked food, seafood, meat, whatever, and they'd cook it up with rice, which the Muslims brought to Spain, and saffron, which they also brought, azafran, arroz, these are all Arabic words, and they would cook it in a big pan to use it all up so that then Friday, after the Jum'ah prayer, they would have a big feast. But they wanted to use up they're very thrifty. They would use dried bread and turn that into migas, for example. There's lots of dishes, very characteristic dishes, especially from the south and from Valencia that came from Muslim times. So, take a breath. They terraced huge tracts of hostile mountain terrain to make them useful. So, in mountain areas, and this is also information that's taken from knowledge that's come directly from places like Yemen. If you have a slope like this that's rocky, as soon as it rains, all the topsoil is going to be washed off and it'll end up in a river. And eventually it'll silt up rivers and the river will be unusable or unnavigable. So if you cut it into a sort of step shape, then you have a flat area, which when it rains, that water will sink in and any organic matter will biodegrade and you'll end up with earth, and that'll be useful. So if you drive around the Granada area, for example, the Granada province, you'll see mountains that are just like steps, and that's from Moorish times. Muslims actually hand dug those. It's also very much like what the Incans and the Mayans did. They also brought and acclimatized dozens of varieties of fruit trees and different kinds of foods. They brought oranges, lemons, figs, pomegranates, mulberries, apricots, sugar cane. They made large plantations of sugar cane in the south, along the south coast, where it's very it's tropical. They call it the Costa Tropical. They also importantly brought better varieties of olives, because the Celtiberians had eaten olives, but they were very small, tough, bitter varieties. They weren't olive oil making varieties. So they cultivated them en masse. There are still trees in this area. I live near Granada, where you can actually see olive trees that are over 1,000 years old. Some that were probably even planted before the Muslims, which is really extraordinary. And often, like a 1,000-year-old olive tree can still produce, and it can produce maybe not very much, maybe they're very small olives, but it'll make an oil that's very, very tasty and coveted. They also acclimatized those trees, because if you take plants directly from one climate to another, they'll often die. So they would do it in stages. And they had all that knowledge. They had knowledge of how to do that, how to graft, for example. They combined almonds and roses to make beautiful flowers. I mean, they had such a rich knowledge of gardening and planting. So around the cities would be these whole rings of orchards, around Cordoba, around Sevilla. And the Alhambra was a Palatine city. It had dozens of these orchards. It had plural mosques. It had graveyards. It was a whole self-contained city. It fed everybody that was living there. So they blended all this knowledge and techniques from the Greeks, Persians, Romans, Arabs, North Africans, Yemenis. They were a very outward-looking society. It was a melting pot of cultures. And there were also Jews and Motharabe Spanish Christians. Motharabe means Musta'arab, it's Arabized. So especially towards the end in Granada, towards the end of the Andalusia period, there were whole towns of Motharabe Christians who spoke entirely Arabic and wore Arab dress, living in the Granada province. The arts were also influenced by all of this abundance and this burgeoning of society. Granada was very wealthy and was well known for its silk, which it traded with Italy, especially people from Genoa. The silkworms were grown on white mulberry leaves. That's the only plant that silkworms will eat. And there were massive plantations of white mulberries all over the Alpujarras, which is the area south of Granada. Pottery, they developed Moresque lusterware. Again, look this up. There's some beautiful examples of this on the internet. It's imitation of gold. It's a kind of glaze which imitates gold, because the Muslim rulers were forbidden from drinking from gold vessels, so they had to drink from ceramics that looked like gold. Well, they wanted it to look like gold anyway. Architectural arts. The Muslims were also renowned for their skill with brickwork and tiling, particularly, and carving stucco. Also mosaics. The sort of zillage that you might be familiar with in Morocco was exactly the same in Al-Andalus. In fact, the word for tile in Spanish is azulejo, which comes from a village. So all of this incorporated knowledge brought from overseas, but they developed it in their own style. Even after the fall of Muslim rule in Aragon, for example, so that happened fairly early on. I can't remember exactly the date, but the Muslims were actually allowed to stay there on condition that they continued to build, because they were such good builders. They were also known as farmers. Farming and building were the two things that Muslims were very prized for, particularly in Aragon and Valencia. And so the people Muslims who were allowed to stay were called Mudéjars. And if you look at, for example, Teruel is the town in the Aragon province. It's a UNESCO heritage site, World Heritage Site, because of its Mudéjar architecture. So there are churches built in Moorish style. And what it looks like is very fine brickwork, sort of reliefs, and cut brickwork also. Sometimes it would, in Moorish architecture, they would have, in Muslim times, they would have like maybe Kufic Arabic in the brickwork, or designs that were very similar, or they would actually cut Islami patterns, the Arabesque patterns into it. And then they would also have on the roof tiles, they would make typically green or blue and white glazed tiles on the roof, and domes as well. The Granada Cathedral is it's a classic sort of Mudéjar piece of architecture, even though it was the Jama mosque that was razed. So, oh golly, I have to whip ahead. I keep going off on tangents. So Convivencia, this is another thing that we can really draw on. So it was famous, Al-Andalus was famous for its largely harmonious coexistence between the three Abrahamic religions. Jews were often valued advisors and physicians at court. Every court had Jewish viziers and physicians. This is considered by Jewish historians to be a golden age for the Jews. The Jews of Toledo had been mistreated by the Visigothic Christians, and when the Muslims arrived, they opened, allegedly the Visigoths abandoned the town and the Jews opened the gates. And then when the Muslims continued their trajectory north, they left control of the city in the hands of the Jews. So they were very there was a very tight coexistence. In fact, and if you look in Toledo and Seville, there's some amazing synagogues that the style, the architectural style is exactly the same as Moorish architecture, but maybe with Hebrew inscriptions instead of Arabic inscriptions. Christians living under Muslim rule had dhimmi status. Also Jews living under Muslim rule, they had dhimmi status, which meant they were protected. They had to pay a special tax called jizya that protected their right to freedom to practice religion, build houses of worship, so synagogues, churches, monasteries. And the Christians were even allowed to make wine and farm pigs. There was no pressure to convert, but many of them did. And that wasn't just to avoid the jizya tax, the tax, as they would then be obliged to pay zakat. So it wasn't totally idyllic. Under the Almohads and the Almoravids, there were pogroms and persecutions, particularly of Jews. However, these were periodic, so I think we can say that they were exceptions to the rule. In Valencia, even after the fall of Muslim control of the area, Muslim laborers and artisans were so valued that the Christian landowners would very often protect them. They would allow them to use empty barns as mosques and madrasas, and they turned a blind eye when they did Islamic rites such as weddings and funerals, and that's going into the 1700s. There are church records of this. They would even pay fines, huge fines, and sometimes faced imprisonment for the sake of protecting their Muslim workers. I have read of one guy who was actually executed for protecting his Muslim workers. There were Christian administrators of the Inquisition who called attention to the suffering of the Moriscos. So a Morisco is a Muslim who had been forcibly baptized. They called them Morisco, literally means Moorish, like a new Christian. So their conversions were quite rightly suspected of not being sincere. There were some sincere conversions as well. But because so many Muslims were rebelling and revolting, particularly in the Granada area, well, yeah, in the Granada area, that in 1616, they started actually expelling the Muslims. So the mainstream narrative of Spanish history is that the Arabs came, they conquered, they dominated, and then the Christians chucked them out. And it's not the way that it was at all, because the vast majority, maybe 90% of Spanish Muslims were descended from converts. So there were Muslims from Granada who were exiled and forced to walk thousands of kilometers, sometimes hundreds of kilometers or thousands, to dispersed areas in Castilla de la Mancha, Extremadura, Aragon, Valencia, Seville. Ironically, these are places that had Muslims in them already. And so the Muslims of Granada, when they were being redistributed, actually refreshed the Islam of their co-religionists. So I'm going to have to skip along a little bit because I'm running out of time slightly. So those Muslims, as I mentioned earlier, about 40% of Spanish Muslims remained in Spain, and another 10% probably returned from exile. Some also blended in with the Gitanos, the Gypsy population, the Roma population, which is why there's a strong imprint on flamenco from Islamic music styles. So they were living as crypto-Muslims, and they've left an indelible trace on Spanish culture in food. For example, sweets, almost all the sweets you will find in Andalusia, they're made with almonds, they're made with aniseed, they're made with cinnamon. Aniseed and cinnamon were brought by the Muslims. Almonds were massively cultivated by Muslims. Lifestyle, language, there were about 2,000 words in the Spanish dictionary of Arabic origins. So I'm quickly going to just give you a few little reflections, what I take from all of this and how we can apply it now. First of all, the importance of pluralism. It was a really successful society because it was open. It was open-minded. It accepted that we need to communicate with other people and learn from other people and keep our borders open and the borders of our minds open to knowledge wherever it may come from. Even if it's challenging, even if it's maybe disrupts what you have come to think, come to believe, maybe that's the beginning of something new. We're all interconnected and interdependent. Culture is very fluid. We're not living in these little hermetic bubbles. Islam is also, it's like water, as it's often said. It takes the shape and the color of the receptacles. This was something that was uniquely European. Andalusi script, for example, was written, I forgot to mention this earlier, as part of the knowledge revolution. It was written with a round-tipped nib, a round-nibbed reed pen, which made it very, very fast. There was no difference in line thickness. So what that meant is that it wasn't sort of monumental calligraphy like thuluth. It was just very fast. It's like handwriting. But that's actually the only Arabic script that developed in Europe, and that's part of European heritage, and that's something quite extraordinary, I think, because when we look at the Ummah, it's so diverse, it's so pluralistic, but we have to keep in mind that there are all these different branches, and they're all important and fascinating. Also, I think that what I get from this is the importance of understanding history. If you understand your history, then you know who you are. The Reconquista, as it was described, was a really brutal process of Christian armies from the north of Spain taking power and land from Muslims who had, you could say, they had also captured that land and conquered themselves. However, the word Reconquista, which is used now to refer to that period, actually didn't exist at that time. It wasn't used then. These were conquests, they weren't reconquests. Because logically, if they were reconquests, it would have been Visigoths who were recapturing the land that they previously controlled, and they didn't. These were new kingdoms that were taking power for the first time in those areas. But now Reconquista is a word that the Spanish right-wing party Vox is using in their campaign against immigrants and immigration. So they want to reclaim Spain. So you can see how ethno-nationalism is a really dangerous thing. But if you understand history, then it cures that. I think it cures that kind of myopia. Seeing the downfall of Al-Andalus, to me, is also instructive, because they did achieve amazing things. They had incredible stability. But if you look at the story of the kings and the queens, to be honest, they were pretty much just as narcissistic as anyone else. They weren't necessarily very inspiring people. Some of them were, quite inspired. But the people themselves, often their narratives are not recorded. But you can see their inheritance in the material heritage of Spain and the material heritage, the inheritance that you can see in just being here. There's poetry in the landscape, and this is what I would like to actually end with. To me, what I learned from Al-Andalus is that Islam has its own sacred ecology, and that's something that's really beautiful, and it's alive. It's not just abandoned. It's not something that's just in history books, or it's not just a philosophy or a theory. There was a farmer that owned a piece of land next to a mosque near where I live. Old Christian Spanish guy, and he told his Muslim neighbors, when you're planting potatoes, you should plant them facing Mecca. So all these things have been passed on over 500 years. That connection has not actually been lost. It's tenuous, and it's often kind of disguised. The Quran teaches us to approach the care of the earth as khulafa. We're the vice regents. We're here to maintain harmony. We're not here to dominate. We're not here to grab. So one thing that a couple of things that I'd like to just end with, because I'm a bit of a language nut, and you know, I love etymology. The word for a water reservoir in Spanish is alberca. Alberca comes from the Arabic albirka, and that comes from the same root, morphological root, as baraka. Why? Because ba, ra, kaf refer to kneeling, as in the way that an animal kneels in order to drink from a pool of water, or a person kneels in order to pray. And there's one other word which always blows my mind when I think about it. The humble broad bean in Spanish is an aba, H-A-B-A. This is directly from the Quranic word for seed, habba, and that comes from the same root as hub. So I want to just leave you all with those seeds, and hopefully you can go and explore more about Andalusia history. But before I end, I'm going to sing a song. And just find the, okay. Do we still have time? It's 7:45 exactly.
Yeah,
I'm just going to sing.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to sing a few verses of Al-Mudéjar. This is a praise poem written in Al-Jamiado, which was one of the languages spoken by the Spanish Muslims, based on Vulgar Latin, but written in an Arabic script, hence Al-Jamiado is from Ajami. And it was hidden, as many, many books were, because after the Reconquista, millions of books were burned, literally taken out into the plazas and town squares and burned. And so people would hide Arabic texts. And this one was found hidden behind a false wall in a house in Aragon, when someone was fixing their house up. We don't actually know how it was sung, but because of the Spanish Muslims who fled to North Africa and formed Andalusi ghettos in various cities in Morocco and Algeria, they took with them their musical forms. So we actually have melodies that come from Al-Andalus. And Ali Kila of Al-Firdaus popularized and recorded this song with a couple of melodies from Al-Andalus. So it goes like this. يا حبيبي يا محمد يا حبيبي يا محمد يا حبيبي يا محمد والصلاة على محمد وعلى آله وسلم. Señor, fez tú a sala sobre él y feznos amar con él. Sácanos en su tropel, jus la seña de Muhammad, jus la seña de Muhammad. Ya Habibi ya Muhammad, ya Habibi ya Muhammad, ya Habibi ya Muhammad, wassalatu ala Muhammad. وعلى آله وسلم. Faste hasta la de conciencia sobre la luz de la creencia, exiliado con reverencia y dada salam sobre Muhammad, y dada salam sobre Muhammad. Tu palabra llegará luego, será recibido tu ruego, abraza hasta la me entrego. Estos son los bellos de Muhammad, estos son los bellos de Muhammad. Quien quiera buena aventura y alcanzar grado de altura, ponga en la noche oscura las alas sobre Muhammad. Ya Habibi ya Muhammad, wassalatu ala Muhammad. Ya Habibi ya Muhammad, wassalatu ala Muhammad.
Thank
you everyone for listening.
Thank you. That was so amazing, mashallah. Thank you for taking your time out and speaking to us today. I've really enjoyed today's session and I've honestly learned so much, especially about the knowledge revolution with people like Ibn-Tufayl. I think it's also amazing to see how many words that you said actually stem from Arabic, as well as the diversity within the society at the time and the inspiration the Spanish used from different cultures and countries. And as you said, it's so important for us to stay open-minded. Thank you everyone for joining, and I'll end with Surah Asr. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wal إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Thank you again, and inshallah see you all next week.